You said a lot about the role of the media in a so-called democracy. I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class. And you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity. Probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it, you know. Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. And it works right through graduate school. I mean, by the time you get to graduate school, it's already a little more varied because some real contradictions develop in the system. The problem is that you can't have progress this way. You know, now especially in the sciences and engineering, that's a problem because the corporations need science and engineering. You know, if you don't have innovation, you're really in trouble. So they have to encourage creativity and independence because you can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, you know, and thinking new thoughts and so on. And there you got a real contradiction. It's hard to train people to be creative and challenging and so on, and yet to ensure that somewhere else in their lives they're conformist and obedient and never think. So you have problems. It's a serious problem in Japan, incidentally. We think of Japan as this tremendous superpower, but that's very misleading. Japan, for example, is very poor in science, for example, and they're aware of it. And part of the reason is it's part of the same thing that makes them good workers, obedient workers. It's a very obedient society, very deferential and conformist society, and one effect of that is that you know there are real constraints against independent, free thinking, and you see it in the sciences very clearly. But it's a problem here too. So there are those contradictions, and when you get to graduate school, they're beginning to show up. They show up much less in the ideological subjects, because there it doesn't matter so much if people have, you know, profits aren't made by historians having original ideas about the French Revolution, so they can have conventional ideas. And that means that the pressure to try to support innovation and freedom is much less, and the pressures for conformity, on the other hand, are much greater, because in the ideological subjects it begins to be dangerous if people think the wrong thoughts. It's not so dangerous if they have new ideas about physics. But nevertheless, you know, you begin to get a little flux in the system by the time you get to graduate school. And even at lower levels you find it. I mean, there are teachers who do stimulate thought, and sometimes they get away with it. And all the way through, you know, if people are learning things, you just can't control, you can't make them just regurgitate what they heard. Now, there's a lot of pressure to turn the schools into the Marine Corps, and there's a lot of support for it. For example, there's this bestseller last couple of years by Alan Bloom. That was all over the supermarkets, Closing of the American Mind, you know, huge bestseller, supermarket racks, which is where I read it, and things like that. Well, you take a look at what he's saying, And there was plenty, a lot of enthusiastic accolades for it and so on. He was saying that a couple of us smart guys will decide what the great thoughts are, and every student will memorize them, and that's education. Okay. Well, that's a way to turn people into pure automata. Even if they happen to pick the great thoughts, there is no way less likely to get anybody to think about those thoughts than to make that the curriculum. That finishes them off, and I think that's the purpose, really. The purpose is just to impose authority, Here's the great thoughts. All this other stuff is rubbish. Just learn those and you're okay. I'll pick them, you memorize them. That's basically the line. Now, of course, that's the opposite of education. That's the way you study Talmud or something like that. But it's very popular, and I think it reflects the same concern over the crisis of democracy. In fact, Bloom himself was extremely, the incident that really got to him was a case in Cornell where he was a professor, where some black students took over one of the buildings. And he said that's just like the Nazis, it's back to the Nazis. He has a whole business about the Nazis and so on and so forth. Well, you take a look at what happened in that. He doesn't tell you what he thought and he says the faculty capitulated, just like Heidegger capitulated to the Nazis and so on. What actually happened, if you look back, is that there were real grievances. Undoubtedly, the students shouldn't have done what they did and go into the building with guns and so on, but it was settled very amicably. It was settled amicably, nobody was killed. The grievances were to some extent dealt with, and the net result was better than it was before. Well, he doesn't tell you what he thought they should have done, but it's sort of implicit. I guess they should have bombed the place or something like that. But that's what really set him off. And in general, what set many people off was the 60s are now described in the literature as if it was a time when students were running around burning libraries and destroying the foundations of civilization and so on. What was actually going on is they were asking questions. They were raising questions. They were looking into things that people hadn't looked into before. They were not just obedient. And from the point of view of a lot of the faculty, that's equivalent to burning the buildings. You can't, that small distinction, you can't make that. There's pressure to turn the schools back to the days when you didn't have to worry about those things, like disobedient students asking questions about things that you didn't tell them to think about and so on. Well, let's take a look at the war on drugs, right? It's been declared probably 20 times in the last 20 years or so. Every couple of years it's declared. It's declared against a background of understanding. For example, it was studied years ago by the RAND Corporation, the main government advisory corporation, and the Army, in which they investigated just straight cost-benefit analysis of various ways of treating the drug problem. Drug problem's here, it's not in Colombia. So they said, well, which ways of dealing with the problem here are cost-effective? And they found, which will surprise no one who's paid attention to the history, that the most cost-effective way of doing it is prevention and treatment. Okay? In fact, if you think about it, that's the way one of the worst drug problems has been handled. There is a drug which is much worse than cocaine. It's called tobacco. It kills far more people than cocaine does. And it was handled pretty well by cultural change. So if you look through the 1980s, it's a class issue. So people with education and degree of privilege simply adopted a more healthy lifestyle. They stopped smoking, they stopped eating red meat, they didn't drink as much coffee, and so on. There were no police, nobody carried out chemical warfare in North Carolina and Kentucky to destroy tobacco fields. It was simply an educational process, a kind of cultural change that led to a significant decline of the use of, by far, the most dangerous drug among people who were a part of that cultural change that took place thanks to their privilege. Okay, now that's exactly what the RAND and the Army studied years ago. They weren't, of course, discussing tobacco, but that's exactly what they concluded about hard drugs or marijuana. They said the best
the cheapest and the most effective way of dealing with it is prevention and treatment. Well, there's another way, use of police. Okay, that's much less effective and much more costly. There's a third way, interdiction at the borders. That's still more expensive by quite a large margin and far less and far more costly. And the worst way of all, way more costly than anything else and totally ineffective, is what we call fumigation, but what in fact is chemical warfare. I've been down to southern Colombia and seen some of it. It's chemical warfare, which is driving huge numbers of peasants off their land, destroying their crops. Colombia has the second biggest refugee problem in the world after Sudan. And they're driven into urban slums, and multinational corporations come in and start mining, and so on and so forth. That's the least effective and the most costly. And the fact that we do it, again, if you can kind of abstract yourself and pretend you're a Martian looking at this, is just kind of unimaginable. I mean, the number of people in Colombia killed by U.S. tobacco is way beyond the number of Americans killed by Colombian cocaine. If you go to a country like China, it's astronomically more. Okay, do they have a right to come to the United States and carry out chemical warfare in North Carolina and Kentucky because they have a tobacco problem and it's coming from here? Yeah, I mean, you can't even speak the words. It's so outlandish. But we do it and we think it's just fine. Even though it's known to be the least effective, the most costly, and totally immoral, as we see right away if we think of the situation reversed. Well, that's been going on for decades. That's the war on drugs. It hasn't affected the use of drugs here at all. In fact, just take a look at the cost of drugs and availability, barely changed. Well, when people carry out a so-called war for years and years, when they know what the consequences are going to be, and they have plenty of evidence that that's exactly what the consequences are, and it has no effect on drugs, a rational person will begin to ask themselves, is this a war on drugs? Okay, I mean, are they totally insane? Is it a war on drugs? Or is it a war to, in Colombia, for example, part of a war of counterinsurgency, to clear peasants off the land so that multinational mining corporations and agribusiness can come in and so on? And in the United States, is it a war on drugs? Or is it an effort to get rid of what are called the dangerous classes? People, if you look at the history of Prohibition, there's good work in legal history on the history of Prohibition. It's very typically aimed at what are called the dangerous classes, people who are kind of getting in our hair. So what we call Prohibition, banning of alcohol, wasn't aimed at wealthy people in Westchester County, New York, and so on. They could do whatever they liked. But it was aimed at working class people and immigrants and the bars in downtown Manhattan. Marijuana, if you look at the prohibition of marijuana, it was not on medical grounds. It was because it was used by Mexicans. And then it was used in the 1920s by blacks in the Harlem Renaissance. And then, of course, in the 1930s, the Bureau of Narcotics had a big problem. Prohibition came in, and they had this huge apparatus, and what are they going to do with it? So they had to find something, so, okay, figured we'll go after marijuana. But the drug of the dangerous classes, if you look at the whole, in fact, this goes back to the 19th century. I mean, in 19th century England, gin was prohibited, but whiskey wasn't. Well, just take a look at who was drinking them. And that runs right through history. These are wars to control the dangerous classes. In fact, the explosion of the war on drugs here was in the 1980s and since. And during that period, the U.S. incarceration programs just flew off the spectrum. I mean, back around 1980, the U.S. was sort of slightly at the high end of industrial societies in per capita incarceration, but within the spectrum. And now it's 5 to 10 times as high as comparable countries, not because there's more crime. In fact, crimes remain kind of steady, and it's still relative to other countries what it was. And if you take a look at who's in jail, yeah, the useless people, black males. people who we can't incorporate in our society. This is the residue of slavery, of course. They don't have different genes. So yeah, they're the ones we get rid of. And in Latin America, there's a name for it. It's called social cleansing. The dangerous classes, you send out the death squads and you kill them and leave them under the bridge. We're more humane here, so you put them in jail forever. The imprisonment, it's not just the level of incarceration, but the savagery of it is just unknown in comparable countries. Like Amnesty International did a study a couple of years ago of children in prison without chance of parole, so permanent imprisonment. I don't remember the exact numbers, but they didn't deal with countries that don't have statistics, like Sudan. But in the countries where you know something about what's going on, I think they found something like maybe 2,500 cases, and about 2,400 were in the United States. I mean, this includes cases of, 12-year-old kid who happened to be in a room where a felony murder was carried out. Okay, he's in jail for life. Actually, I've seen cases like this in prison, which are, well, I'll tell you one case, just I don't know how prevalent it is, but during the civil rights years, I was down in Jackson, Mississippi for a demonstration, and I was with Howard Zinn and a couple other people from up here, and we designated ourselves proper self-congratulation as a New England professors delegation. So we were escorted through the prison by the police chief and that sort of thing. And in the prison, Jackson, Mississippi prison, which is not bad by usual standards. I've been locked up myself in worse prisons. But as we're walking down the halls, we passed one of these huge cages, a lot of people in the cages, and they were all black men. But as we walked past, a child tapped on the bars and happened to be standing here, he asked me if I could get him a drink of water. So I turned to the police chief and I said, can I get him a drink of water? There's a fountain down the hall. So he said, sure. So I came over and gave him a drink of water. Well, when we got back to the office to talk to the chief, we asked him, well, what's that kid doing in there? So he asked some clerk to look it up. And it turned out that they just found him in the streets. And they didn't know what to do with him. So they put him in jail. And he'll stay there for the rest of his life. Now, cases like that are not counted. But they're just part of the savagery of imprisonment of the dangerous classes. And most, a very high percentage of the people in prison are drug-related offenses. So you find a kid in Roxbury with a joint in his pocket, happens 3 times, okay, he's in jail for who knows how many years. It has nothing to do with reducing drugs. You can see that from the statistics. But it does have something to do with purifying the society of the people who we find threatening, the dangerous classes, usually people we're crushing in one form or another. I don't see any other rational interpretation of the so-called war on drugs.
Thank you.